Professor Spooner, how are you?
Good afternoon, Frank, or good evening, I should say.
Yes.
um, the last week we talked about a major risk in the globalizing world of pandemics,
Hmm.
and there's another big problem that I think we should devote some time to, and that is the increasing amount of waste. And there are really no plans to deal with it. A lot of more and more countries are trying to cope with it as it keeps increasing, but there's no overall plan for the problem as it gets worse. And it really is a problem of global urbanization because waste is produced more in cities than anywhere else. And it's as cities, as more and more, as a larger and larger proportion of the world population becomes resident in cities, the problem of waste is going to get worse. It's not only that they produce more waste, but it has to be moved further in order to get rid of it.
Hmm.
And whether you've noticed, recently there's been news about China starting to worry about this problem and trying to deal with it. I wonder what it's like in India because I haven't been to India for a while, and India has the same population as China in a very much smaller space. And again, the population has got to where it is now very recently, and so one wonders how they're dealing with it. Europe is introducing new measures to deal with waste, and so are other countries. And of course, here in parts of this country, in Philadelphia, for example, we introduced recycling in, I think, 1984. But large parts of the US still do not have recycling, especially in the South. Um,
Many
so,
countries do not have recycling.
well, many countries don't have recycling, but I mean, I think waste is probably a bigger problem in the wealthier and larger countries than it is in the smaller or less opulent countries. Anyway, there's been a lot of publicity recently about the plastic in the oceans, and a big part of the problem, I think, is packaging.
Yes.
And when I started shopping, there was no packaging. I used to take my own bags, I'd walk half a mile to the stores, buy the food loose, put it in the bags, and bring it home.
Hmm.
Um, and that was towards the middle of the last century. And then gradually, plastic, I think, was introduced first in the 50s and was adopted very soon, very quickly. But then, of course, gradually more and more things needed to be packaged, and glass was heavy, and metal had other problems, and plastic became the main form way of packaging everything. And even though some things are packaged in paper, and we're encouraged to recycle paper, nevertheless, it's really paradoxical, ironic that there's a lot of paper that we have to throw out because it can't. If it's got some sort of glaze inside to make it waterproof, you can't recycle it.
Right, right.
So the problem really is getting worse and worse, I think, faster and faster. And it's difficult to say. It's another of these things, of course, for which we have no international agreements, no
No,
way of organizing things beyond the nation state.
there are no international agreements, and
So,
you're correct in noting that it varies significantly from country to country. When I was in Singapore recently, it's very strict there on how you dispose of waste. You can be in a subway, and there are no fewer than four different types of receptacles, each with stick figures on the covers and things that supposedly are universal language that required me to stand there for a minute or two to understand what they were saying. But one was bottles, one was plastic, one was paper, and one was waste, like food. So, and if you make a mistake, somebody will come over and say something to you. If not, a citizen will say something to you, telling you you're putting it in the wrong receptacle.
So it's not only putting it in a receptacle, it's putting it in the right receptacle.
Right.
And actually, Singapore is one of the countries that has been in the news about this in the last couple of days. So they seem to, well, and Singapore generally seems to have a good reputation for being a well-organized political unit. Mm-hmm. There aren't many countries about which you could say that.
Let me ask this. I'm sure that Malthus, if he had been possessed with some hallucinatory purpose, could have sat down and computed the growth in the population into the future with the rate of waste that it produces, and eventually figure out when the waste would essentially outweigh the humanity. I mean, this is the direction that we're essentially going in, isn't it?
It is, and the problem of waste has obviously been increasing for a long time. And there are things that you can find out about waste in the Roman Empire, for example, in the city of Rome, at any rate. But it doesn't get much attention in the ancient world, mm-hmm. Or even in the medieval world, and partly, of course, because there was no packaging. Mm-hmm. So much of the waste until as late as the 19th century in many parts of the world was just thrown out the window, mm-hmm. and into public space. Mm-hmm. But it was a very different sort of waste, so it caused different problems. Now, it's very difficult to see. I mean, obviously, what we have to do is to find a way to reduce the amount of waste. And that's going to, as more and more people come to live in cities, that's probably going to be more and more difficult, because the problem of packaging is going to become more and more serious. Actually getting marketing, getting the things you want to sell, apart from people getting the things that they need, people who want to sell things, getting what their products to possible customers, all requires more and more sophisticated packaging. And as it is at the moment, they're not required to worry about what happens to the packaging when the contents are taken out. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so obviously Singapore should be held up as an example. But I'm surprised from what I've seen that Singapore says nothing about controlling the people who make the packaging. And I would think that's what has to be done.
Right. Let me tell you an interesting anecdote. All right. You probably have never seen the TV series Mad Men. It's about advertising executives in the U.S. in the 1950s. It's won a number of Emmy Awards, and there's a character in it who's a fine, upstanding individual with a fine, upstanding family, 2 children, and in the late 50s, there's one of the episodes has the family going on a picnic in a beautiful verdant park, sitting there on a blanket, eating out of a hamper, eating out of paper plates, paper cups, finishing up the meal, and simply leaving all the paper there, folding the blanket up, putting it into the trunk of the car, and driving away. And they clearly didn't give it a second thought. And you can't, in the year 2018, watch that without exclaiming out loud, what are they doing? But then I thought about it for a minute, and I remembered it really was not until Lady Bird Johnson's beautification of America began in 1964 and 65 and 66 that litter became a real big issue, and everybody began to understand it. So behaviors have begun to change. I mean, things take a little time, but in 50 years, behavior has changed dramatically, so much so to the point that even in my little town, we recycle. So you're correct in saying that while human behavior might be changing, nothing is being done on the producer side to lessen the amount coming into the stream. That really, it's like standing in front of a giant faucet. You can't stop it.
What you're saying about litter is brings up memories. It's as though the word almost was coined at that time. We never used to talk about litter before then.
No.
And then all of a sudden, everybody was talking about it. I've forgotten the role of Lady Bird Johnson.
Yes.
But it's interesting that it came down from the top, so to speak.
Yes. Yes, and then there was that famous American Indian that was part of the Keep America Litter-Free campaign, the Indian with the tear running down his cheek when he looked out at the litter on the prairie. And it's the same kind of thing you see on these isolated Pacific atolls now because of the prevailing currents. There's just mountains of plastic trash there that just come from God knows where. So yeah. There are state-by-state initiatives in the United States, such as deposit laws, both on bottles and on plastics, and also on those ubiquitous plastic bags that are used in supermarkets to pack things into. The District of Columbia, in particular, has a 5-cent recyclable on those plastic bags.
It has? They do recycle plastic bags?
You can collect plastic bags and bring them back into the supermarket and get money.
Really?
Yep.
That I didn't know.
Yep.
Well, I've been trying to, since I do the food shopping once a week, I do my best to get everything without plastic. But it's difficult. It's difficult.
So let me just ask this.
However,
go ahead.
I was going to say, we come back to the problem that we often come back to, which is it starts off with awareness, but then in order to do something about the growing awareness, we have to think in terms of organization. And it seems as though the biggest problem of all in the creeping globalization of the world, and especially global urbanization, is how to organize larger and larger numbers of people and everything that they need in order to live in a sustainable environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's going to take a pretty concerted effort to go after multinational corporations that are producing packaging. I mean, for example, you know what McDonald's biggest product is, don't you? It's not beef. It's not potatoes. It's paper. I mean,
but I agree that big companies seem to rule much of our lives. However, given everything that's going on at the moment about trade, I'm sure that one could make sustainable packaging a requirement for a trade agreement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, that would make a big difference to the big companies. But then, of course, that wouldn't control their lobbies in Washington.
Right, right. Well, it's one thing too. In the ancient world, waste was presumably much more decomposable, if you will, than it is now. I mean, the decomposing rate of a plastic jar is what, 5,000 years or something like that? I don't even know, but it's forever. So
before the Industrial Revolution and before our ability to create so many artificial materials, waste was a very different sort of problem. Mm-hmm. It was still the larger the number of people you had living together, the greater the problem of waste. And of course, the whole idea of drains and sewers was only introduced relatively late. But that obviously is a very different sort of waste problem from what we're dealing with now.
Indeed, indeed.
So I think what we need is a bigger effort to deal with the problems of organization of civilized life in a globally urbanized world.
Well, I think that something like that would be, there are very few people these days that do not recoil if they're walking on the street behind somebody and see them litter. So it's something that everybody can support. Actually, it might be an interesting idea. Nobody can argue with this. So people can debate about whether global warming is fact or fiction or naturally occurring or not. But the idea of throwing a Coke can out of a window of a car on a highway is something that everybody can rebel against and say that's not a good thing to do. Well, thank you, Professor Spooner.
Yeah, but you're right in saying that.
Go ahead.
You're right in saying that that's not done now, whereas I remember when it used to be done.
Oh yes, yes, yeah, and
throwing things out of a car window.
Yes, and that's why this episode from that TV show Mad Men was so revealing, because when you recoiled when you saw it, but then if you were old enough, you remembered. You said, "Well, wait a minute, that's what people did. It was completely natural. You just left the stuff there. You never thought twice about it." So,
yeah,
at least we're thinking twice about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor.
Okay.
We'll look forward to next week. All right.
See you next week.
Goodbye. Bye. Bye.